No one at Ashmore spoke the first wife's name until she did. I have told this story exactly once to a man who needed to hear it. That man was myself, standing in the portrait gallery at Ashmore on the night everything changed, staring at a painting of a woman I had never met, whose shadow had nearly swallowed the woman I loved. I rehearsed the facts in the dark, alone, the way a soldier rehearses a battle after the fact. What happened, what nearly didn't, what I almost lost because I was too haunted by a lie to see the truth standing in front of me. Her name was Clara. That is where I will begin. She arrived at Ashmore in November in the company of Lady Harwick, who had engaged her as a traveling companion, which is a polite name for what she truly was. An educated woman of reduced circumstances, orphaned young, hired to carry shawls and fetch books and be invisible. Clara was 23, slight, with gray eyes that noticed everything and a habit of going still when she was frightened, like a creature that has learned that stillness is safer than flight. She had no money, no connections, no family name worth mentioning. She had a quiet mind, a steady hand, and the particular courage of someone who has never been given the luxury of falling apart. She had also, I would later learn, never heard of Ashmore, nor of its master, nor of his first wife. That ignorance, I think, was what saved us both. Lady Harwick had come to Ashmore for the shooting season, as she did every autumn. She was my late mother's cousin, a comfortable and gossipy woman who filled silences with anecdotes and rooms with the smell of rosewater. I tolerated her visits because she had known my mother, and because tolerating things had become, in the 3 years since Helena's death, my primary occupation. Helena. I did not speak her name aloud if I could help it. Neither did my staff, my tenants, or my friends. Helena, Duchess of Ashmore, dead at 26 of a fever that swept through the village in a wet autumn, had been beautiful, witty, admired by everyone who met her, and mourned, as I understood it, by the whole of the county. Portraits of her hung in the gallery in the morning room at the foot of the stairs. The housekeeper, Mrs. Penwick, kept her rooms exactly as she had left them, curtains drawn, the vanity untouched, her gloves still laid on the dresser as though Helena had simply stepped out and would be back by tea-time. I permitted this. I am not proud of it. I told myself it was sentiment. I told myself it was grief. I told myself many things in those 3 years, and none of them were quite honest. What I did not permit was conversation. If a guest made the mistake of mentioning Helena's name over dinner, her beauty, her wit, the tragedy of her passing, I would go so quiet that the table would go quiet with me, and the subject would be buried before the next course arrived. My staff had learned not to speak of her. My friends had learned not to speak of her. Lady Harwick, who had known her, would only murmur something vague about such a loss and change the subject with practiced efficiency. The house operated around Helena's absence the way water operates around a stone, shaping itself entirely to what was not there. Clara had not been given the instruction manual. She arrived on a Tuesday, mud on her hem, a carpetbag over her arm, looking at Ashmore's facade with the calm expression of someone who has decided in advance not to be intimidated by large things. Lady Harwick swept in ahead of her, already calling for tea. Clara paused in the entrance hall, looked up at the vaulted ceiling, at the chandelier, at the portraits lining the staircase, and then her eyes found mine, where I stood at the top of the first landing, and she did not flinch. Most people flinched. I was, in those years, not an easy man to look at without flinching. 3 years of deliberate solitude had done something to my face, some narrowing and closing off that strangers tended to find unsettling. Helena used to say I looked like a man rehearsing a funeral. She had said it with a laugh. I could not remember now whether I had laughed with her. Clara looked at me for a moment, a frank, unhurried assessment, the look of a woman who has learned to read rooms quickly, and then she looked away, entirely without anxiety, as though I were merely a feature of the house like the chandelier. Noted, filed, not alarming. I felt absurdly both dismissed and relieved. She was in the house for 3 days before she said anything to me beyond courtesy. I encountered her in the library, which was the one room I kept for myself, the room where no portrait of Helena hung, where I had dismantled the small shrine of her presence and replaced it with my books. Clara was there when I arrived, in the early morning before the household was awake, standing before the shelves with her head tilted sideways, reading spines. She heard me come in, turned, and said, "I beg your pardon, Lady Harwick said the library was open to guests. I'll go." "Stay," I said. I meant it to come out warmer than it did. It came out like a command. She stayed. She did not seem bothered by the command. She chose a book, a volume of letters, natural philosophy, not what I would have expected, and settled in the window seat with it, drawing her feet up in a way that was entirely unconscious and entirely out of keeping with the formal behavior I had grown accustomed to at Ashmore, and she read. I tried to work. I mostly watched her read, which I recognized as undignified, and did not stop. After an hour without looking up, she said, "The house is very quiet." "Yes," I said. "It doesn't feel like a quiet that belongs to the house," she said. "It feels like a quiet someone made." I did not answer. She turned a page. Outside, the November light came thin and gray through the library windows, and somewhere deep in the house, a clock ticked, and we sat in silence together in a way that was not, somehow, silence at all. She found the east wing on the fourth day. I learned this from Mrs. Penwick, who came to me with a face arranged into careful neutrality and said that the companion had wandered, that she had tried the east corridor, which everyone knew was not for guests, and had found the door to Helena's room standing open. The latch, apparently, had been faulty for weeks, and no one had wished to say so, and had looked inside. "Did she touch anything?" I asked. "No, Your Grace. She looked in and then she stepped back and she asked me whose rooms they were. I told her they were the late Duchess's. She asked me how long the late Duchess had been gone. I told her 3 years. She said, 'And the rooms are kept as they were?' I said, 'Yes.'" Mrs. Penwick paused. Then she said, "I see," and walked away. That was all. That was all. I spent the afternoon waiting for a question that did not come. Clara did not ask me about Helena. She did not look at me differently at dinner. She passed the salt when Lady Harwick required it and discussed the volume of letters she had been reading with a mild intelligence that made Lady Harwick beam and made me, increasingly, pay attention. She knew now that the rooms were preserved. She had said, "I see," and walked away. She had made no comment, offered no sympathy, issued no careful condolences. She had simply looked, understood, and let it alone. I found that more unsettling than any amount of well-meaning words. It was Mrs. Penwick who first told her. I did not know this for some time. I would learn it later from Clara herself, on the night the whole edifice came down. But it happened in the 3rd week of the visit, when Lady Harwick had gone to call on a neighbor and Clara had stayed behind, and she had helped Mrs. Penwick with some small domestic task. The kind of helpful, unasked thing Clara did quietly and without drawing attention to herself. And in the easy silence of that work, Mrs. Penwick had begun to talk. What she said, Clara told me later, was this: she wasn't what they say she was, the Duchess. She was bright and beautiful and charming, yes, but she was also very unhappy here, and she made him unhappy. And now he is frozen in it, and nobody will say so, and it is killing him, and I have served this family for 40 years, and I would like someone to know the truth. Mrs. Penwick had never said it aloud before, in 3 years. She said it to Clara, a woman she had known for 3 weeks, who was a stranger and a paid companion, and had no power and no position and nothing to gain. She said it to Clara because Clara, she told me later, was the kind of person that the truth found its way to. I found Clara in the portrait gallery on a Wednesday evening, standing before the largest painting of Helena, the formal portrait, commissioned in the 1st year of our marriage, Helena in blue silk, her expression composed into that specific smile she had worn for company. The gallery was lit by 2 candles, and Clara stood close to the painting with her arms folded loosely, looking at it the way she had looked at the library shelves, curious, direct, without sentimentality. I stopped in the doorway. She heard me, she always heard me for all her stillness, and said, without turning, "She was very beautiful." "Yes," I said. "Was she kind?" The question dropped into the room like a stone into water. I felt the ripples of it reach me across the dark gallery. No one had ever asked me that. In 3 years of condolences and murmured sympathy and careful tiptoeing around her name, no one had asked me that. "No," I said, "she was not." Clara turned then. She looked at me in the candlelight, and I saw on her face not shock, not pity, not the particular greedy alertness of someone collecting a scandal. I saw only the expression of a woman who has been given a piece of the truth and is holding it with both hands, carefully, aware of its weight. "I am sorry," she said. That is a lonelier kind of grief. Something in my chest, which had been clenched since November 3 years past, moved. "She was brilliant," I said. "Enchanting in company, everyone loved her. I believed when I married her that what I saw in company was what she was. I did not know until too late that she was most herself when no one was watching, and that person was not the one I had married. I stopped. I have not said that to anyone. I know, Clara said. I could tell. She did not come to me. She did not reach for my hand. She stood at a considerate distance and looked at me steadily and said, "You have been carrying someone else's version of her, the beautiful, tragic young Duchess. That is not the same as mourning her." "No," I said. "It is not." "You are allowed to put it down," she said. "The version, you don't have to mourn what was never quite real." The candles guttered in a draught from the passage. Helena's portrait hung above us both, serene and composed and entirely herself, brilliant, difficult, gone, and I looked at it for the last time the way I had been looking at it for 3 years, with guilt and grief all tangled together, and I understood, standing in that drafty gallery with a woman who had known me for 3 weeks, that the guilt was not for failing to love her enough. The guilt was for having spent 3 years pretending that I had. It broke open slowly, over the remaining days of the visit. Not dramatically, not in declarations. In the way that thaws happen, not a single crack, but a gradual yielding, warmth working through from underneath. I began to seek the library in the mornings, and Clara was always there, and we read in the same room and talked, and she had opinions that surprised me and asked questions that required thought, and she laughed with a restraint that was not shyness but simply economy. She laughed when something was genuinely funny, not to smooth over silences, and the first time she laughed genuinely at something I said, I felt it rearrange something in the vicinity of my ribs. Lady Harwick, to her credit, noticed everything and said nothing, which was the most diplomatic she had ever been in my acquaintance with her. On the last evening I came to the library and Clara was packing her bag. The visit was over. She would leave with Lady Harwick in the morning, back to the borrowed life of a paid companion, carrying someone else's shawls in someone else's carriage. I stood in the doorway. She looked up. "I am glad you came to Ashmore," I said. She considered me for a moment, the way she considered everything, seriously, without performance. "So am I," she said, and then quietly, "I hope it's a little easier now, the house." "It is," I said, "considerably." A silence. Outside, the November wind pressed against the windows. Clara set her book into the bag and straightened. "I think," I said carefully, "that I would find it considerably less easy if you were not in it." She went still. That particular stillness of hers, not fear, I knew now, something else, something she was holding carefully. "That is," I said, "a very inadequate way of saying something I am finding difficult to say with any elegance. I find I cannot improve on it, so I will say it plainly. I do not want you to leave. And if you were willing, if it were in any way agreeable to you, I would very much like to give you a reason to stay." Clara looked at me for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "I am not Helena." "No," I said, "you are not. You are the exact opposite of Helena in every way that matters, and I am profoundly grateful for it." Something broke open in her face, the last wall, the small one she'd kept up, the one that knew she was a paid companion, and I was a duke, and the world had rules about such things. And she looked at me, and her voice, when she spoke, was entirely steady. "Then ask me properly." I did. We were married in the spring, in the small chapel on the Ashmore grounds, with Mrs. Penwick weeping into her handkerchief and Lady Harwick looking insufferably pleased with herself, as though the whole thing had been her idea. Perhaps it had. I have never asked. The portrait of Helena was moved, at my instruction, to a room where it was catalogued and treated with respect, because she had been real, and her difficulty had been real, and she deserved neither worship nor erasure, only the plain, honest acknowledgement of what she was. Mrs. Penwick, when I told her, wept again, different tears. Clara's name, spoken aloud in every room of Ashmore, did not echo the way Helena's had. It settled. It belonged. She is reading in the library as I write this, that same window seat, those same feet tucked up in a way that remains entirely undignified and entirely her. And Ashmore is full of a quiet that is not absence but presence, not a stone in the water but the water itself, moving freely. There is a particular luxury, I have learned, in a home where the name spoken aloud is the name of someone who will answer. I had not known I was waiting for it. I know now that I was waiting for it all along.